Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bruce Jones. I'm at the Brookings Institution, where I'm part of the Strobe Talbot Center on Security, Strategy, and Technology. And it's my distinct pleasure to host us today for a discussion on India's role in a changing international order. This event is timed to coincide with the wrap-up of India's participation in the G7 summit in Hiroshima, as well as the planned Quad summit. Didn't quite take place given Biden's unexpected detours. But India's participation in two mechanisms that I've come to indicate or to reflect a growing partnership between India and the West on some key strategic questions. But it also comes after a year in which there's been a lot of debate and a lot of confusion about India's posture on international order and its role on the world stage, in particular arising from confusion, even consternation in the United States and Europe over India's posture vis-a-vis Russia during the Ukraine war. To help us understand how India actually sees its role in the international order, we have a terrific panel to discuss the issue. I'll introduce each of them as we go. And we'll cover a range of topics and bring in several questions from the audience, which were received by email. I want to start with Raja Mohan. He is a senior fellow at the Asian Society Policy Institute, was the director of the Institute for South Asian Studies. If you can find a highly credible think tank, Raja has worked there. If you have had a thought on Indian grand strategy, he's written a book about it. One of the most accomplished scholars and authors on Indian grand strategy and Indian foreign policy. So Raja, let me ask you first to help us understand how India sees itself in this wider debate around international order. And one of the themes that's constantly in the discussion is this notion that India is looking for some form of strategic autonomy or updated non-alignment within this kind of wider terrain. And perhaps you could give us your thoughts on how you see that set of issues. Don't forget to unmute. Raja, you're muted still.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was saying thank you for inviting me for this conversation and to this important discussion about India and the international order. When you asked me about strategic autonomy as some kind of a defining feature of India's engagement with the world, but I think there tends to be a mystification of this concept, the way the discourse takes place in India and how the rest of the world reacts to it. I would say there are essentially three elements to this idea of strategic autonomy. One is a fairly mundane one, which is all countries, all sovereigns in the international system seek to maximize their autonomy. I mean, I think that's the essential feature of international system of multiple sovereigns. So there, I think there's nothing special about it. But I think as a large country with a major power ambition of its own, I think the emphasis on India on independent decision making. We hear that in the US too, which is the most powerful nation in the world, often says, look, we don't want to take orders from the UN or some kind of a committee that wants to run my wars or my nature of my politics. So I think that way it's very similar to what the US thinks, that it needs an independent decisions of its own concerns. Second, I think, which is the post-colonial India, that India won its independence after prolonged colonial rule. Therefore, protection of independent judgment in foreign policy became one of the key features, that it was simply not going to cede that choice of judging the world politics to some other centers of power. So that is the second feature. And I think what we've seen in India is somewhat deploying the concept of strategic autonomy in the last 30 years, largely against the West. Because I think post-1991, the US and the Western policies of intervention in the internal affairs of other states, I think that produced a reaction, apprehensions. So partly, I think the emphasis on strategic autonomy was to defend against that kind of interventionism in the West. And I think today there's self-reflection in the West itself, the benefits and costs of such intervention. A third aspect, I think, which is really the imperatives of nation building, the imperatives of state formation, of economic development, often put India at odds with the presume norms and demands of the developed states. Like if India does what the US has actually done, of stitching together a state through violence. I mean, violence is endemic. State makes war, war makes state. That's common to every single modern state's history. But I think there's a tendency to be judgmental in the West often, how the state formation is taking place in India. And I think that creates a whole range of problems where I think India wants the way it can secure its own state building from the interference and the attempt by the others to set the agenda. But I would conclude with one important thought. The emphasis on strategic autonomy does not rule out alliances, coalitions, and partnerships. So I think often there's a tendency to conflate the two. After all, it was Nehru who invented non-alignment, to turn to the US after China attacked India in 1962. India turned to Soviet Union in 1971 when the US and China seemed to be supporting Pakistan's repression in Bangladesh. And now Mr. Modi has brought India very close to the United States to deal with the challenges from China that it faces. So I think it must be important to remember, whether we talk about strategic autonomy or multipolarity, Indian state responds to the threats and circumstances. So the ideology is adapted to the need and not the other way around. The actions are not defined by ideology, but the actions that the state needs to take will be justified by modifying the ideology.
That's extremely helpful. It's also subtle, which means it's incapable for Washington to relate to, but we'll come to that in due course. Garima, you work at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. You run the India Trilateral Forum. You've written a great deal about Europe's relations to India and vice versa. We were with the EU for a while, as well as GPPI in Berlin. Can you give us your thoughts on how this looks from Europe and how you see Europe fitting into India's overall approach to international order and grand strategy?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bruce, for inviting me and making me a part of this discussion. I'll just pick up from where Raja ended. Talking about strategic autonomy, he mentioned in his second point that it was often used in a post-colonial context. And I think Europe is a case in point that illustrates his second point, as well as his third point, that strategic autonomy doesn't preclude having alliances or building coalitions. And the India-Europe relationship is an extremely interesting example of that. So you can see a visible increase in India's outreach towards Europe as early as 2012, 2014, which even predates the current downturn in India-China ties. It was since then New Delhi has started crafting a policy for Europe's sub-regions, breaking away from the sort of Cold War era subdivisions of East and West Europe. That includes the Nordics, the Central Eastern European countries, Brussels, as well as the EU. Now, this sort of turn towards Europe and a way of looking at Europe beyond the post-colonial sort of lens, beyond the tensions that stemmed from this relationship, has been driven largely by a convergence around the question of how to deal with China. Now, everybody has sort of heard of the very famous 2019 European formulation of China as a partner, competitor, and rival. What is less well known is a few months before that, in December 2018, Europe had a new strategy on India, calling it an essential partner in maintaining a multipolar Asia. So it's since then that sort of both India and Europe started grappling with the question of how to deal with China and the consequences of China in their respective neighborhoods, that sort of these bridges between New Delhi and various European capitals started building. Another factor for India is, of course, in reaching out to Europe, is developing national capacities needed to balance and respond to China. And so we see all the European-Indian conversations focus on technology innovation, particularly 5G, AI, semiconductors, green tech, on trade and investment, security and defense. Let's not forget, France is the second largest defense equipment partner for India after Russia. But also India is now intensifying cooperation with Italy, Sweden, the UK, etc. So it sort of fits with the broader trend of increasing strategic engagement with the West. Then we will talk about the US. We know about the Quad countries, G7. What I found really interesting was Minister Jaishankar spoke at the Bled Forum in Slovenia, and he spoke about the fact that all binaries of West and East are not relevant anymore. Now, that's very interesting point coming from an Indian foreign minister. And since then, we've heard him talk about India being a Southwestern power, a bridge between the West and the global South, developing democracies, etc., which really sort of shows you how differently India is positioning itself from what we intuitively think of when we think of Indian foreign policy. Of course, there are limits to this convergence, and that became quite apparent with Ukraine. India's dependence on Russia has, of course, constrained its strategic autonomy in this case, and India has found difficult to take positions as critical of Russia as its Western partners would want. Surprisingly, though, this hasn't completely derailed India-Europe ties. In fact, we've seen more engagement from European member states in trying to understand Delhi's position, I think. One reason for that is that post-Ukraine, convergence on China has only deepened. As Europe has learned crucial lessons on reducing dependencies on Russia, it's now applying them to China. Taiwan is discussed like never before in Europe. How difficult it was to build coalitions in Asia sort of has pushed Europe to think a little bit more about understanding the nature of China as an actor as well. On the question of Russia-China alignment, I think Europe and India don't exactly have similar assessments of where that stands. But in the long term, both understand that the consequences of Moscow dependent on China would have consequences for the balance of power in both regions. I'd like to end with, since we're talking about strategic autonomy, I'd like to end with the European debate on strategic autonomy. And now that's very different from the debate in Delhi. Europe sees itself caught between US-China competition, and not all European leaders have this position, but influential ones like President Macron do, and are thinking of looking at a middle path or a third way for Europe and how to sort of not be caught between these two blocks. For India, on the other hand, it seems the bigger question is China. That is the consequential challenge. And for India, the idea is that all sort of foreign policy relationships are seen through the lens of China, who can help balance China. And they would rather see more engagement with the United States and the US in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that is one big difference, as you'd asked in your original question of, where does India converge with the West? And in this case, with Europe, that's a crucial difference. And I found it interesting. I was speaking to a former official in DC yesterday, and I asked, what is easier to work with, the Quad or the EU-US TTC? And the Quad, hands down. Thank you.
I'm just imagining that conversation, but yes, indeed. Let me turn to Tanvi Madan, who's my colleague at Brookings in the Center for East Asia Policy, also directs the India project at Brookings, and the author most recently of The Fateful Triangle, looking at India, US, China relations. Tanvi, you're also a close observer of US-India ties, of the 2+2 mechanism, and of the Quad. So I'd like to bring you in for your thoughts on how this has unfolded over the last year and how you see India's posture in the international order at this juncture.
Thanks, Bruce, and it's a great pleasure to be on a panel with Raja, Garima, and you, and thanks to our colleagues Hannah, Laura, and Sophia to help put this together, as well as our communication and conference staff. I think the way particularly, and I'll come at this from on thinking about where kind of how India sees the US. And I think the fundamental difference you've seen, particularly from the 70s and 80s to where we have been in the last 20 years, is in India, you largely saw, in the Indian government, you largely saw, as well as society, the US was seen as the spoiler for India in the international order largely. Whether that was the security, economic order, even technological. So in the security order, the US was the country that was aligning with China and Pakistan and enabling them in many ways, including looking the other way at best, while China enabled Pakistan's nuclear program, for example. In the economic order, there really wasn't, India was going through still a phase where it was looking at trade. It was starting to open up in the 80s, but nonetheless, other than kind of brief moments of alignment, these weren't countries that looked at openness in the same way. And then even on technology, India saw the US as the country kind of blocking it. There were export controls after India's 1974 peaceful nuclear exposure, nuclear test, however you want to see it. And so it was largely seen, the US was seen in antagonistic terms as the spoiler, as the blocker of India's ambitions and objectives. I think today it's almost diametrically opposite if you look at the last few governments and how they see the US. Broadly, and I'll come to where the differences are, but broadly and generally, these governments now see the US as the enabler or supporter of India's rise and its role in the international order. And you've seen this, for example, in terms of the security partnership, where, speaking to Garima's point about the major challenge for China, India being China, the kind of US as a fundamental partner in both being a balancer of China and shaping a favorable balance of power, ensuring a multipolar Asia, but also in terms of enhancing India's own capabilities. So in academic terms, both in external and in helping internal balancing for India as well. I think you've also seen in terms of the economic partnership after India's kind of opening up and liberalization, there's a lot left to be done, but nonetheless, post the 1990s, you really see kind of some more convergence. Now, there were still differences on openness. Trade used to be kind of a subject of divergence. These days, the US and India seem to be the same page on trade, so perhaps somewhat differently. But nonetheless, even on things like economic security discussions, strategic trade, you see a lot of convergence with the US. And it is seen as a partner as India tries to build its own resilience and reduce its vulnerabilities and exposure to China, even in the economic space. That's true of technology as well. US seen as a country that is going to help India's economic and technological transformation, perhaps the country that can most do that. And you've seen a technological partnership that's also going into innovation, partly because of the talent dimension and labor mobility. And R&D facilities, for example, of American companies being set up in India. So you see now this idea that whether in terms of defense technologies or non-kind of defense or dual purpose technologies, commercial technologies, the US seen as a partner. And then finally, other than kind of seen as in the security order, economic order, technological order, even in the global order, in many ways, you have seen now India see the US as the one, along with perhaps France being the other country, essentially kind of help India in terms of both its interests and membership in international organizations, whether that, for example, is at the UN Security Council, where while kind of sometimes in the Indian public discussion, people still remember, the Russians and the Soviets used its veto for India. The last Soviet veto for India, Russia veto, was in 1971. Russia's been bandwagoning with China, on some questions, or at least not as forward-leaning about India in the last decade or so at the UN Security Council. It's been the US and France, the US helping enable India's waiver at the Nuclear Suppliers Group and going to bat for its membership. And so I think you find many such instances. And now the US and India working together, even in terms of coordinating. This was in the Quad statement a few months ago, the ministerial statement about working together in international and regional organizations to think about the leadership of those organizations. So I think you've largely seen India now seeing the US differently, or at least the Indian government. Let me just kind of come to the differences just very briefly. I think where you see some of and this coordination taking place both bilaterally and kind of this through these coalitions or minilaterals, and we can maybe come to a little bit about that later. But on the differences, I think it comes down to there's some principles that, as Raja said, as a post-colonial country, actually the US is also a post-colonial country, just has a lot more years of being post-colonial. But India sees the issue of, for example, sovereignty in a very different way. So it's less so than it was perhaps 20 years ago, but a bit of a sovereignty hawk in terms of domestic issues. And so, non-interference. Now, India has interfered in other countries, kind of, or spoken out on other countries' domestic development. So it's not that this is a hard and fast rule, but generally, in terms of if you compare the US and India, US a lot less sensitive if, say, somebody comments about what's happening here internally. Many people would actually agree and say, yes, we do need to do more on X. We do need to do more on, democratic strengthening our democracy. In India, that comes across, and not just with this government. This has been a general case where there is this there's this skepticism, if not suspicion, of and pushback against countries, not just the US, but others commenting on India's internal developments. And this spills over into the sanction space, where there is a sense that the US too has weaponized interdependence and used its power economically. So I think those are the differences. And then it comes down to this basic question of strategic autonomy. I think the Indian governments have now come to the conclusion that the US, for the reasons I said, as its role as an enabler, can actually help through particularly its enhancement of India's capabilities and its other partnerships through its other allies and partners, can actually help provide India space, that it is China that is actually the bigger constraint on Indian strategic autonomy and not the US. Having said that, there are still a number of folks in India, maybe not in government, but I think the view also exists in certain quarters of government, that, and whether this is because it's the US per se or the US happens to be the grand hegemon in the world, is this reaction of saying among some who say, look, the US is the country that is constraining India's economy, India's autonomy, and therefore India needs to be conscious of that. I think what the Indian government's view is look, the US can be helpful. It could possibly also constrain, but the way to actually deal with the US constraint and strategic autonomy is to build other partnerships, is to diversify India's partnerships, which is where Europe comes in. But it's also where Russia comes in for India, though I think we'll see that role perhaps get more constrained as Russia-China relations deepen.
Terrific. Very, very helpful. It's also a good segue to a question I want to ask each of you, and you could answer in your own ways. We'll go in the same order as we initially did, which is around sort of major fault lines in the Indian debate. So sort of where are those in this period, either inside government or between government and the wider community, around the United States, around the economic order? What are the major issues that continue to drive debate in the Indian firmament? Raja.
Yeah, I think on the economic side, it's quite clear that it's often framed as, US is for globalization, or the West is for globalization, or India is hesitant about it. Today, as Tanvi mentioned, or Garima mentioned, the US policy itself has changed. I think those of us who saw Jake Sullivan's speech at Brookings Institution a few weeks ago, that the system, the question that how globalization has panned out has not been helpful to a large number of countries and sections of people within those countries. So I think much of the arguments about globalization today are going to be reframed. And I think as we do that, my sense is there is going to be a lot more convergence between India and the US in terms of how do we build new resilient supply chains to limit weaponization by one country, building trusted partnerships, those kind of areas. I think today there's actually more convergence. But the key to this is, of course, how do you, it's not just the Indian government that's supposed to, opening up its market. It's really the Indian capital. After all, Indian capital has its own interests. And I think, unlike in many countries in Asia, India had a developed capital by the time of independence. And this developed capital wants to, safeguard its own market. And that's where I think greater collaboration over a period of time might open up new possibilities and not see it as merely somehow India, some kind of a antediluvian when it came to the logic of globalization. Second, I think on the larger question of international security, my sense is for a long time in the 90s, we thought US was the problem. And that's the reason why, when US said, look, we want to take your nuclear weapons away, we want to, maybe fix the Kashmir problem. we prefer what we think what the Pakistan is saying is right. Then India tried to balance that by talking about a multipolar world of RIC and BRICS and those kind of areas. But today, it is China that is blocking India's nuclear aspirations. It is China that messes around in the Kashmir question. It is China that defends Pakistan on the question of terrorism. Therefore, I think the logically today, as the contradictions with China become the principal problem for India, India's capacity to do and willingness to do more things with the US have dramatically grown. And the third aspect, I think my sense is, if you look at the larger questions of economic growth, this year India-US trade is $190 billion with a bit of surplus for India. And the potential for this trade far overwhelms anything we can think of vis-a-vis China or with Russia for that matter. Russia is really, last year we'd seen some surge, but otherwise the trade with Russia in 2021 was just $9 billion. And then we have this Indian diaspora in the US, which is really, and the West as a whole, in the English-speaking world, the Anglo-Saxon world, if you will, where the Indian diaspora has done well. So I think there's a number of connections that we have today with the West are beginning to produce, I think, a new template in which India and US and India and the West will have differences, but today there's a lot more common between them to manage those differences. Finally, I would say that the West too needs, as we saw the G7's share in the global GDP is coming down. And if the US wants to retain any kind of leadership in the international system, it needs to find a way to accommodate India into the larger Western coalition, into the global hierarchy of power. So therefore, the US needs India too. And I think this is not what is not understood widely within Indian debate or in the US debate. And that's one reason why people accuse the US. Why is it being so soft on India? Because I think US is looking at this over the longer term, that amidst the rise of China and the challenges that it presents, that India being part of the Western coalition will make the prospects for that coalition to succeed higher. And for India, which faces its main contradictions from China, working with the US and the West gives it the security it needs. So I would say we're really at a historic moment where, for the first time since India's independence, India and the US, India and the West can actually collaborate in producing a better order. And the terms of that endearment will have to be negotiated. It's not that the US will come into Delhi and say, guys, this is what, here is our checklist. Are you signing off or not? To one where actually the terms of endearment, the terms of engagement will have to be negotiated. And I think Delhi is open.
That's very, very helpful. And it's interesting, when the Biden administration took office, there were some who were exploring G7 expansion, but very striking to me that in their mind did not include India, which I thought would have been a major mistake to have gone for a round of G7 expansion and not including India. That struck me as a very unwise move. I want to come back to the question of how it might be that the United States and Europe, which would have to be part of this too, can have that negotiation and find the right structures in which to accommodate and negotiate over India's participation in the order. So that's also then a segue, Garima, to you, how you see some of these fault lines, or picking up on Raj's point and how Europe reacts to this, because of course, one way to think about the changing dynamics of order is that European power has diminished somewhat in terms of its share of GDP. The US has been relatively constant in share of world GDP. And in some of the key institutions where India would have a stake in helping set the terms of order, Europe would have to give some ground for that to happen. So, Garima.
So on the question of fault lines, I think particularly in the Europe-India partnership is one on the question of economic policy. And I think a lot of European engagement with India rests on the promise of India as an economic partner. For a lot of European member states who are looking to reduce dependence on China, move towards a China +1 model in terms of moving supply chains away from China, companies who are looking to invest away from China, they're sort of rediscovering India and hope that India lives up to the economic potential. And I think they hear the right sounds from the Indian government when they reach out. But perhaps that's not quite met when they actually go to India and try to work both with the state level and the federal level. So in terms of delivering on the economic promise, I think that is a challenge also for India to ensure that the promises and the aspirations, let's say, of its government are met by other institutions and agencies within the country that make this sort of diversification that Europe longs for easier and sort of facilitates that. I think that is still an issue. Another issue, particularly, I mean, when I work on Europe, so I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up. I think Tanvi brought up in the case of US-India relations as well, this general suspicion of the West, and it often feels like the Europe-India partnership will be easily derailed with one or the other, areas where they don't agree, or even when it comes to convergence on China, if they're not speaking exactly in the same terms, if they're not fully like-minded, then it feels there are many constituencies in Delhi and beyond who would like to sort of write off the partnership with Europe. So I think that's another fault line that sort of needs to be managed. However, as Raja mentioned, India really needs other partners, and the need to develop partnerships with Europe is also to, diversify, not just have dependence on one, the United States or the other Quad countries. And then finally, I think India's relationship with Russia and how that develops will, of course, also be a factor that largely impacts the Europe-India relationship. And I think many in Europe are trying to understand, our understanding of, I mean, New Delhi has been very candid about its constraints when it comes to the Russia relationship with European interlocutors. So I think they do understand where India stands. However, how this relationship will develop, that's a question mark. And I think, as you mentioned, for Europe, Russia is the primary challenge. It is how Ukraine unfolds will have quite a few consequences in terms of Europe as a geopolitical actor, how much weight it has, not only in its own neighborhood, but also in the Indo-Pacific. So I think in those terms, there are definitely voices in Europe that still don't understand what is India's position on Russia. How is this relationship going to develop? What does that mean? Does it have a veto power on how much India engages with Europe, etc.?
I have to say that from my own observation, the first phase of the Ukraine war, I thought there was some validity to Europeans' criticisms of India on its UN votes, but also some pretty bizarre positions. For example, criticizing India for buying oil when the Europeans were still buying vast amounts of Russian gas. So these things are not straightforward. Tanvi.
So I think I will say, and I'll talk about kind of some of the fault lines I see. I will say to something you said, Bruce, that I actually think official Washington now gets some of this nuance. And to your point, to Garma on kind of differences over the kind of Russia question, there's learning going on. And I think you've seen even in the last year when it comes to the US and India, learning on both sides. I think the fundamental kind of fault line through which a lot of the others flow when it comes to, I think, India's thinking about the international order is this question of how open to be to the world. And there is, again, it's not that it's not understandable. India has been subject to sanctions before. India has been subject to its partners, and that's not just the US, it's the Soviets as well, changing their mind. So it's understandable that India is concerned about dependence, about exposure, about vulnerability. But I think there's, frankly, sometimes in the public debate, more concern about what the world can do to India and not enough discussion about what the world can do for India. And that can sometimes lead to kind of missed opportunities. And so even when it comes to the US, there isn't really, to me, when people say, where will India stand in US-China competition? I think for one, India's primary kind of prism is not US-China competition, it's India's China challenge. But nonetheless, India can't take the same position it did in the Cold War with US-Soviet competition. It's just fundamentally different for India. The debate in India, to me, is not kind of that it's not the US versus China. I think India does tilt, it does align. And on this, it's aligning very much with the US and other countries that are concerned about China's actions and intentions. The debate is between how close to get, how far and fast. I don't think there's a China debate anymore in India. It's how far, the debate is how far and fast do you partner with countries like the US, and particularly the US? Because I think the debate is about how much do you open yourself to these partnerships versus how much you do go it alone? And I think the thing that eventually I think the government realizes is that actually even to eventually build India's own capabilities to be able to go it alone when it wants to, those partnerships are inherently important to build India's capabilities. It will be faster for India rather than trying to go it alone. So I think the fault line being is there's a spectrum when you think about if India wants to build resilience and power. It is the spectrum is self-sufficiency versus kind of this diversification approach. And, I think that's a spectrum, and people, come down on different sides. So what does self-reliance mean? For some, it means they want to be self-sufficient. And for others, it means self-reliance in the sense of a kind of a more resilient sort of thing where you do have your own capabilities and power and influence. And that actually gives you some space even with that diversified portfolio of partners. I think there's a couple of others. I think something Garima mentioned, which is kind of the Russia question. Because for India, Russia has traditionally, whether in terms of enhancing India's capabilities or being a strategic balancer to China, Russia has very much been part of that diversified portfolio of partners. And I think, this is a fault line. I think people now, to some extent, understand it, might not like it in the US and Europe, but have a better understanding of it. The question, I think, is, India still wants to kind of have China, Russia as a balancer. But as Russia, the contradiction is as Russia-China relations become closer, this is posing, this is going to be a fault line for India with Russia, and it will have to sit and figure out how to grapple with it. I think there are many in India who are convinced that Russia and China there'll be another Sino-Russian split as there was during the Cold War. But as then, it's true today as well. Yes, it might happen. The thing is about timing. And right now, they're getting closer. They're not splitting. And right now is when India is facing this challenge from China. So I think that's the kind of other fault line, but it's one that's in play, I think. And I think finally, there is this aspect of, I think the US and Indian governments, for example, when it comes to these international order, or if you want to break them down, security order, economic order, even they are cooperating, they're managing differences. I think the governments are actually engaging well. What I would say, though, is I think they need to do more to take the publics along. For the reasons Raja said, the Indian public is through societal, economic, other links connected to the US. But you see, even in the Indian kind of government, discussion, this is perhaps the most open to the West government we've ever seen in India. But the public discourse, what is going on WhatsApp channels, what is being discussed on primetime TV, is kind of how the West is the foreign hand that's out to constrain India. And this is totally disconnected with the government's official approach. And I think there's a sense that you can continue to do both those things and it'll be fine. But it speaks to something that I think needs to be addressed, which is this idea that this relationship with the US, with the West, is natural. The reasons for it are evident. And this mirrors in the US. That, where is the case being made? Other than to kind of Indian media channels, or an Indian prime minister will come to the US and talk about why is the US important to India. When do the governments make the case about why they are actually aligning with each other? And you just don't hear that. So, there'll sometimes be criticism, track one is moving along, track two is behind. Well, the governments need to make the case. It might be a natural partnership, natural allies, as Prime Minister Vajpayee put it, but it needs a lot of nurture, and it needs communications to the publics about why, and stopping hiding the fact that these are important countries for each other.
Good. And, as you said, I do think there is a new degree of subtlety in official Washington's understanding of this issue. You and I have talked about this a little bit. It's one of the sort of silver linings, in a way, or the fault lines of the debates on Ukraine at the UN, is it has raised awareness and understanding of some of these questions in official circles. And as you say, maybe a little less so in the commentariat. What I want to do at this stage is two things at the same time. I want to bring in some questions from the audience, and how you respond to them. You don't each have to respond to everyone. Feel free to pick and choose. But I'm going to structure it based on a remark that Tanvi made, because one of the things you did, Tanvi, in your opening was you talked about different dimensions of the order, the nuclear, the economic, the security, the political, et cetera. And it seems to me that that's often missed in discussions of the international order. Okay, there's one international order in terms of the balance of power, but there are major domains or major topics and major institutions of order, and a country can have differential relations to those. So I'd like to move through some of those topics. I also want to come to the formulation that Garma mentioned of India, or some in India thinking of itself as a bridge to the global south, and I want to kind of come to that. One of the well, sorry, let me rephrase. We got a lot of questions from the audience. The topic that was in most of them was the Security Council and the question of the lack of an Indian permanent seat for the Security Council. We saw Biden this year at the UN, last year at the UN, talk about sort of leaning into this. We've seen the UN ambassador engage in this, I would say with a kind of mixed degree of enthusiasm, but nonetheless an openness. Is this something that India still cares about in a deep way? Is it just the Ministry of External Affairs cares? Does this matter to India? How would you all see that? And just volunteer if you want to jump in.
I mean, let me step in here. I mean, as a realist, I would say, look, it's like I don't think India should, India wants to be in the UN Security Council, but it should know that it's not going to happen anytime soon. That the Russians and the Chinese are not going to, Chinese certainly don't want another Asian country out there. Forget India, they don't even want Japan there. So I think the important thing for India is really not the formal membership of the UNSC, but an India that becomes the third largest economy, which is an India that works closely with its partners. Its net weight in the global affairs is going to grow. So I would put more emphasis on building a coalition with the Western powers on a range of global issues, rather than depending on, waiting for the UN Security Council gates to open. But I don't think you need that to actually perform a larger role in the international system, because I think our growing weight will give that possibilities for India. Certainly, yes, the UN Security Council sitting there all the time gives you some diplomatic influence, but structurally, it is the nature of India's economic power and the kind of partnerships that it builds and the coalitions that will build actually will increase India's impact. And my sense is that the UNSC is already marginal when it comes to security issues. It's largely marginal when it comes to economic issues. So with the Security Council deeply divided, I don't think getting in at this point, it in a way makes a much difference to India's interests. So I would say focus on interests, focus on expanding global role in partnership with your close partner, like-minded countries, rather than just waiting for this something to drop from the Security Council. And I think our problem is here, as I mentioned before, China is the principal obstacle to a large number of India's international aspirations. And I think if we deal with that in partnership with our friends in the West, a lot of issues will get sorted out automatically in terms of India's aspirations for a larger role in the international system. That is the goal. Security Council membership is only one element of getting there.
Garma, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I agree with fully with what Raja said. I feel like sometimes the issue of UNSC membership and support for India's candidature becomes a good signaling device. And it's often used by partners, particularly in the West. So when France says it, when Germany says that, it's an easy way of currying points. Also in Delhi, signaling that you see India as an important international actor, acknowledging that international institutions as they exist need reform and perhaps are not the most, favorably constructed. And I think it does carry some weight, particularly when coming from Europe, given the sort of historical baggage.
It's a check that you can't cash, Bruce.
Indeed.
People can give us a check. There's no bank that's ready to cash that check.
Well, and if it drives towards China and Russia blocking it, then all to the better seen from Washington's perspective. But as you said, it's in a way of sort of cheap signaling. Another question which came up frequently, and I also want to ask more about, and in a way I think builds directly, Raja, on your point, is around the international financial order, the global economic order, and whether India needs a sort of official seats at the table or whether the economic weight is enough. Does it need a membership in an expanded G7? Does it need expanded shares at the fund? Does it need leadership roles in the bank, et cetera? To what extent do the institutional arrangements of the global economic and financial order matter? Or is it sufficient for India to grow and simply exert the weight that it increasingly has in international economic affairs? Anybody want to chime in?
My sense is, I'll just briefly, I think the US is actually talking about reforming those institutions, probably this time a lot more seriously, given the larger crisis that we have on the economic front. And I think these issues matter to India. And I think for the first time, really, we can engage with the US and the West on these in a far more productive way than we have in the past, merely criticizing these institutions to one of actually formally engaging in how do we reform multilateral lending institutions, global financial order. And I think India has been part of the G20 finance track. India has been engaged with the US today on the Quad and other forums. I would say there is a lot of potential here. And the agenda that the Biden administration has put, again, going back to Jake Sullivan's speech, there is a lot out there wanting to do. And I think India, as one of the large economies, this time around will have a reasonable role to engage in a productive negotiation with its Western partners.
I think here, I would say it's kind of interesting where you again see some of the convergence and divergence. Where I think on the one hand, you've seen kind of progress, especially in terms of these minilaterals. I remember when the CPT or then TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was first proposed. Part of the reason it was proposed is because the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was seen as kind of not being able to move, partly because the West said, oh, countries like India are blocking it. And so the TPP comes up, which India criticizes as plurilateral, and that there should be kind of good old-fashioned multilateralism. Today, you've seen kind of India become one of the innovators in terms of minilateralism. They still use the term plurilateral, but even in some of these economic issues, the Quad is a good example where you see a lot of the same kind of dimensions you're seeing the G7 discuss: supply chains, critical infrastructure protection, talking about critical minerals, diversification, etc. You're seeing some of these telecommunications, you're seeing some of these same issues being discussed, thinking about standards, thinking about those issues. Even in IPEF, the much maligned Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, you do see India taking a more forward-leaning approach, even on some trade issues, and having to think through, even though it's not in that pillar, but through the supply chain pillar of that, coming at some of these questions about imports, for example. So you're seeing some movement on that, but at the same time, you also do still see, and Garma could probably speak to the EU-India Trade and Technology Council as well. That's a form of this, and you see this in bilaterals. But I do think there are still these issues, and about the economic order, where while India and the US and other partners are coordinating in the G20, which is another forum, I think, where you've seen a lot of activity on issues like debt sustainability. How do you get at the debt repayment issue, which restructuring rather than sustainability? How do you actually get at those issues? So there is that work, but I think there is still fundamentally some differences in India in terms of official, the amount of weight and influence it has formally in the World Bank, in the IMF, and their fundamental difference on the use of the US use of the power of the dollar. And the US and Europe's use of sanctions, because India itself has been subjects of sanctions before. So I think you're largely seeing more cooperative than before, but there still are these areas where there kind of are differences. And then, of course, the US and India these days are kind of more protectionist or more focused on industrial policy than I would say a number of other European and Indo-Pacific partners of both countries are.
I think that goes to Raj's point earlier, that this is not just a question of the United States saying, hey, okay, you can come and join the table as it currently exists, but actually in a negotiation about the terms of the international economic order going forward. I want to raise two other questions and suggest, Garma, that you take a first run at them. In my mind, they're connected. Perhaps we don't see them as connected. and again, these are pulling in questions from the audience. One is about climate diplomacy, where India has played quite an important role over the last sort of decade and a half, one of the sort of shaping powers of the emerging climate regime, occupying obviously a very different position than the United States and Europe in that debate. And in my mind, that's a little bit connected to the point you made about the possibility of India serving as a bridge to the global south. And I wanted you to unpack that a little bit, because of course there are places and issues where the United States and the West is in a very different place from the large majority of developing countries. And India is in this sort of interesting position where it's both a major economic player and has still a substantial developmental challenge ahead of it. So those two questions, any of you should feel free to pick either or both, but Garma, why don't we start with you?
Let me start with the second bit of the question of the bridge between the global South and the West. And it was interesting to have these formulations coming in from the Indian government side. And this sort of the first remark that Minister Jaishankar made predated Ukraine. But I think in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, and when it came to talking about the second order consequences of the war on a number of countries in the world that were already dealing with the consequences of the pandemic, the debt crisis, and sort of collating all of that in India's G20 presidency, I think we see this articulated the most clearly, where India mentioned, for example, in Bali, that it played a role in making sure that the final language on Ukraine bridged some of the differences between its partners in the global South and what its Western partners wanted. So I think these are sort of some of the concrete examples by which India is trying to do so. It's really centering it as part of the G20 presidency, and climate is yet another example of that, because India's discourse on climate diplomacy has shifted radically from a few years ago when it was sort of development centered, red before green, that we need to develop first and then we'll deal with climate. And now it's very different in terms of looking at the climate challenge as an integral part of not just development, but also economic policy, industrial policy, etc. And I think in terms of rhetoric, at least, India tries to put that forward. But I think not just on climate, but also on a number of other issues. For example, the role that India can play in places like BRICS, for example, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where there are sort of Russia and China playing a certain role. And can India play a different sort of role, a more balancing role? Can it sort of bring in some of the conversations it's having with Western partners, or have exert a different type of influence in these institutions? That would be something interesting, and I would want to watch for that, how that develops.
Raja, Tanvi, either of you want to come in on this?
I mean, the only thing I'll say on this is, again, we've seen, sometimes there's this view of India as a static, India is non-aligned, it's difficult, it doesn't do stuff with the US, it doesn't move. This is another place where you've seen change, and you've seen kind of in India go from saying, we didn't create this problem and we're not going to do anything about it, it's on you, to saying, look, this is going to affect us, and so we need to be part of the solution as well, even though we didn't contribute to making this a bigger problem. So another place where you've actually seen this go from a kind of India versus West, or global South versus global North sort of discussion, to a more and this is where India and China actually used to, if you remember the Copenhagen summit, in 2009, it was kind of where India and China used to work together. But now you're actually seeing, even in terms of the solutions, where India is working with, not just the global South countries, but also kind of the West for technology and finance, would like to see them do more on both these things in terms of transfer. But, the prime example I'll give you is, the single largest financing kind of the initiative of the US Development Finance Corporation is financing a large solar panel manufacturing facility in India that will help not just India, but potentially others diversify away from, dependence on China. So, there are kind of these interesting dynamics that are also happening in kind of the climate space, which are, again, much more nuanced than you would see with some of the top line statements about where India stands on these questions, or frankly, the cooperation or lack of it between the West and India.
Good. We're getting close to the end, but I want to bring in another major question that came through from the audience, which is around human rights and quality of democracy. And obviously, both the United States and China, and India have some challenges here, human rights in particular on the Indian side. Several of the questions were aimed at the topic of whether the United States should alter its perception of India because of human rights and quality of democracy issues. I will say that in my own observation, talking to the Brits when they had the G7 presidency, this administration, as they were thinking about G7 expansion, the human rights situation in India did bear on their thinking about to what extent there was going to be a kind of values alignment. I would say the Biden administration has not taken that approach. We've seen it, although it talks a lot about democracy in the international system, hosted the Democracy Summit, et cetera. We haven't seen it being particularly preoccupied about human rights issues or democracy issues in India. But so anybody who wants to comment on how India sees this set of issues in relation to its posture in international order writ large, and then we'll wrap up.
It certainly doesn't worry me too much, the human rights debate. I think it's got the US domestic ideological arguments. But as someone who's followed the US foreign policy for a long time, I think it's a bit I think it's a self-deception in the US debate that somehow the US has always promoted democracy or human rights abroad, or the claim that human rights were integral to its international relations. That doesn't stand scrutiny. I mean, I think given what the US has done in the region, I'm not blaming the US. I mean, that's a record that when the US was in competition with the Soviet Union, it dined with the devil in most places. And if you remember, there was a lady called Jane Kirkpatrick, who said Kirkpatrick doctrine was, as long as he's my son of a bitch, it's fine.
Yeah.
That confronting the Soviet Union was the principal challenge for the US, and not looking at the nature of the individual regimes that you're going to decide your policies to them. So I think it's really a post-91 belief in Washington that somehow this is the central way of organizing American international relations. It never worked. It was tried during Carter period, it didn't work. It tried initially during a period of Clinton, it didn't work. I don't see that working. And my sense is, take the Biden administration itself, started in January 2021 as democracies and autocracies. And much of the US strategy since then has been to tone that down, to adapt to the reality of a growing competition with China. Just one example of MBS in Saudi Arabia, January 2021, it didn't matter. So he was going to be made a pariah. February 22, he mattered a lot. He matters a lot now. So I think US is realist, and I understand US has its own ideological debates too. Just like we have our non-alignment, strategic autonomy arguments, the US has its internal debate on these issues, but I don't think it is consequential for foreign policy, because in the end, US, like India, is a pragmatic state that will balance its interests between its economic interests, its security interests, its geopolitical interests, while continuing to talk about an ideology, just as we do. So I think that is the reality in which the US has operated. I'll just conclude with this thought. I've seen the US support the worst modernist groups like the jihadis in Afghanistan, saying that these are freedom fighters. That was just 40 years ago. I'm not even going back in history. And now you come and say, oh, Afghans are corrupt. They don't know how to run their country. We're going to judge them, they score them. Look, I think it's really an internal argument in the Beltway, but I don't see it has any effect on US foreign policy. We've already seen in the national security strategy of Biden administration, where the importance of contestation with China demands that you reach out to other people. And on the question of Indian democracy, I think you should leave it to the Indians. It's too big for you to come in and fix the problem. I mean, you can't. And I think it's a battle that Indian civil society, Indian political parties have to fight. And I think they will fight. I mean, the assumption, somehow India's democracy is falling apart. I think this is really elevating again into serious headlines, what is without understanding the complex processes that are going on. And my sense is, wait till 2024 elections and see India, there will be a battle royal for the soul of India, and I think you'll see that. So to write off large countries and societies with a stroke of hand, Indian democracy is dead. I'll give you a score of 3 out of 10. I mean, I think this is a ridiculous score making in the US, but it has really no effects on the ground. I think on US foreign policy itself.
Very good. Tanvi.
I think there's a few things here. As you said, Bruce, the Biden administration has essentially seems to have made a call along the lines of what Raja said, that this is something Indians need to Indian civil society and the political community needs to sort out themselves. Also, I think this idea that whatever concerns will be largely brought out, discussed privately, and third, that there's this question of would public kind of discussion of this from the administration be effective or actually counterproductive? So I think they've made their judgment. I know there's some discussion in India that somehow there's this very coordinated good cop, bad cop approach going on right now. Frankly, that assumes a certain amount of coherence that I'm not sure any democratic government necessarily has, and that's exaggerated. But I would say there are a couple of things to keep in mind, which is that it is where kind of India is different from all the examples that Raja pointed out. And yes, as somebody who's a historian, I can add to the cases that Raja pointed about U.S. relationships and partnerships with authoritarians. But one of the issues is that India itself is making the case for itself as a democracy, and saying that, look, whether as a security partner, whether as a trusted technology partner, whether as an alternative for companies, the reason that it is different from the country that shall not be named, that is China, what makes India different is its openness, its transparency, its democratic nature. So I think the thing is, it will set expectations, and there will be discussion in open societies then on that basis, since India has put that metric out. The second thing is, I suspect what the concern here will partly also be, and something that India will have to grapple with, and 1980s India is a good example of this. As the US and other countries invest in India as a partner and invest in its rise, think about it as a balancer to China. Part of that is not, that we've discussed a lot India's willingness to do these things with the West or for itself, but in partnership with the West. The question comes to the other questions that have in the past been a stumbling block to this is India's ability to do it. And India has been most effective in terms of its ability when it is kind of united, and it adds to India's power and strength and ability to do things for itself in partnership with others, but alone. And so that I think that question of internal stability and security, that is for Indians to decide, yes, but I think it will affect, potentially there will be discussions about what's going on in India. Can India play the regional and global role that it wants to, that the West wants it to, if it is in kind of argumentation with itself beyond a certain point?
Terrific. Garma, you have the final word.
I'll be quick because I know we are hitting the mark soon. The Europe-India partnership in the past was seen primarily through this lens, human rights, democracy, and a lot has changed since then. European Parliament resolutions on ABC problem in India used to get a lot of attention. That was the dominant frame. And since then, there has been a lot of introspection in Europe. And there's been an understanding that this approach is A, not useful, B, seen as lecturing, C, what leverage does Europe actually have to lead to internal change in India. But I do want to caution on one thing, I do want to bring it up. Because of a lot of the criticism of China in Europe is based and rooted in the values piece, particularly what's happening in Xinjiang, human rights, Hong Kong, it is natural that other partnerships will also be evaluated through that lens. And as India invests more capital in European member states, I think this is something that it'll have to grapple with. That is just normal. This sort of scrutiny will only increase going forward, particularly because a lot of the China question is rooted so much in the values piece. But I do want to mention that there's been a lot of pragmatism and a more pragmatic approach when it comes to this, and limitations of what Europe can do, and not wanting to be perceived as a sort of lecturing colonial, partner.
Perfect. We are out of time. As we wrap, I want to thank Hannah Forum, Laura McGee, Sophia Hard, and our comms team for putting us together. A particular thank you to our panel for joining us. One of the great privileges of this line of work is you are constantly being afforded an opportunity to learn, which is an astonishing privilege, especially at my late advanced stage of life. And I could not think of a better team of people to help us understand these issues in front of us. I thought this was nuanced and rich and actually quite uplifting and quite optimistic. And that's increasingly rare. So my thanks to you all for your thoughts and for joining us at Brookings today.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you.